Synetics Chile presenta Sesión Futuro, un espacio de conversación y reflexión acerca del futuro que surge.
Hola, buen día a todos, ¿cómo están? Bienvenidos a esta nueva sesión de Futuro. Primero que nada les quiero comentar a todos que abajito, casi al medio, pero un poquito a la derecha, hay un botón con un globo terráqueo. Ahí ustedes pueden elegir el idioma en el que quieran escuchar, dado que tenemos una invitada que habla en inglés. Muchos líderes del mundo público y privado nacieron y crecieron, o crecimos, en un escenario de mayores certezas que las que vivimos hoy en día. Hemos transitado de un mundo, decimos, que era mucho más sólido y estable, a uno que es tremendamente líquido. Esto es lo que conocemos como un entorno VUCA, y nuestro país ha sido un claro reflejo de estas disrupciones. Comenzamos el año pasado con la crisis social en octubre, y este año hemos tenido la pandemia del coronavirus, una de las mayores crisis que ha afectado a la humanidad. Estamos observando que hay una creciente necesidad por desarrollar estrategias resilientes que sean capaces de adaptarse a los tiempos turbulentos que nos toca enfrentar y que desgraciadamente parece que llegaron para quedarse. En este sentido, la perspectiva estratégica proporciona este marco, lo que nos permite explorar el futuro, impulsar un cambio, planificarlo y aprovechar las oportunidades y no solo mirar el futuro desde los riesgos. Desde Synetics nos hemos dedicado hace más de 30 años a apoyar en el diseño y ejecución de estrategias en la región, y lo tenemos bastante claro. Es por eso que esta vez tenemos una invitada, Yvette Montero. Yvette es socia y cofundadora de Kedge y de Future Schools, empresa dedicada especialista a la perspectiva estratégica, la disciplina que justamente se encarga de anticipar escenarios futuros para tomar decisiones estratégicas hoy en el presente, de manera que nos ayude justamente a enfrentar de mucho mejor manera este escenario cambiante que nos toca vivir. De hecho, aprovecho comentarles que en el próximo noviembre estamos organizando en conjunto el primer taller de perspectiva estratégica para la región. Yvette, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros. Bienvenida.
Thank you, Alejandro. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yvette, lo primero que te quería preguntar era, ¿cómo tú comienzas a relacionarte con la perspectiva estratégica? ¿Qué hacías? ¿Cómo te diste cuenta de esta necesidad desde el punto de vista personal?
Yes, I started my strategic foresight journey at the Walt Disney Company. I worked for Disney for 13 years in finance and in strategy. And then I was asked to lead a new division focused on the future of work. And I was surprised to find that there was an entire field dedicated to thinking about the future and making our decisions more relevant in the present with that information. So I learned about strategic foresight. It's been over 10 years now that I've been practicing in the field, and I can't believe that I didn't know about it sooner.
Y cuéntanos, Yvette, ¿qué es lo que hacen en The Kedge y The Future School? ¿Cómo llegaste ahí? ¿Cómo se organizaron y a qué se dedican hoy en día? ¿Cómo es la vida normal sacando estos últimos meses de pandemia, obviamente, que nos cambió a todos?
Yes, so we are based in Florida, so it's a very strange time here. We have record number of cases of COVID, yet our theme parks and our stores are open. So it's a very strange time. I made the transition to a principal at Kedge when I met Frank Spencer, who's my business partner. He helped me do work at Disney, and then I joined him to join forces at Kedge. We had the privilege of working extensively with the Walt Disney Company at that time. In fact, through that work, we launched the largest corporate foresight practice that we are even aware of. And we were able to train leaders, 500 or more, across all geographies. We were in Buenos Aires, for example, 5 or 6 times with the Latin America team at Disney, and we made a lot of great partnerships there. So our passion and our mission is to democratize foresight, to make it accessible to as many people as possible, because we believe that the world would be a better place if everyone thought with a long-term perspective.
Qué interesante este concepto de democratizar la perspectiva estratégica. ¿Esto tú lo ves como algo solo para las organizaciones o las empresas o también para las personas y todo tipo de organizaciones?
Yeah, it's really for everyone. Think of strategic foresight as our operating system. So instead of an app that we just download whenever we need to do something, think of foresight as something that works in the background, fueling everything that we do. Of course, organizationally, in strategy and in innovation, but personally as well. Individually, we can be able to make better decisions about our own personal and professional paths using strategic foresight, using scenario planning, and the other tools in the field. So it is applicable to every single person and every single field.
Excelente. Mira, te quiero contar, Yvette, que hace muy poco terminamos un estudio en conjunto con la Facultad de Economía y Negocios de la Universidad de Chile, con Freddy Coronado, y que se titulaba Los desafíos estratégicos para los próximos 20 años de las organizaciones en Chile. Fuimos a preguntarle a más de 30, le llamamos líderes, que son básicamente directores de empresas, gerentes generales, ministros o exministros, gente que está liderando de alguna manera desde algún punto las decisiones a gran nivel en nuestro país. Entonces, mira, te voy a mostrar una de las preguntas que les hicimos. Voy a compartir. Nosotros les preguntamos a los entrevistados cuáles iban a ser las disrupciones para los próximos 10 a 20 años. Y tal como comentaba al principio, nuestro país tuvo una crisis social que hasta el día de hoy está vigente a partir de octubre del año pasado. Entonces lo que sucedió es que el 97% de las veces los entrevistados nos hablaban de que iban a venir disrupciones de tipo social. Luego decían, el 59% de las veces hablaban de disrupciones tecnológicas, el 53% económicas, el 41% de las veces nos hablaban de disrupciones ambientales y el 32% nos comentaban que podían venir disrupciones de tipo política. Te quería preguntar, basado en esto, ¿cómo se compara esto con lo que ustedes ven que está sucediendo en otras latitudes, dado que, como tú comentabas, trabajan en muchos lugares en el mundo? ¿Son las mismas preocupaciones o cambia un poco?
It's very much similar concerns. I think, of course, what you're seeing in your survey is that individuals tend to respond with what is currently emerging. And so it's interesting because typically when we ask individuals and organizations about future impacts, almost always they think of technology. So I think it's interesting that your group chose social, likely because of the ongoing unrest. But the reason that most individuals choose technology is because that's a tangible manifestation of the future. So we have visions of science fiction and flying cars, and I'm actually excited to see that your respondents chose social. Because while technology is critical, we can't just focus on technology. Many people think the future is about technology, but the future is actually about people and how they're going to use or misuse technology, cause political disruption, impact the environment. if you put humans at the center of your work regarding the future, then you'll likely not miss out on different disruptions. But I think it's very interesting, the results of your survey, and how focused the group was on social, but not totally unique, but I think very relevant given the current situation in your nation.
Tú nos mencionabas que trabajan con empresas privadas, pero también con organismos públicos. ¿Las preocupaciones cambian cuando están en organizaciones de un tipo o de otro, o son más o menos las mismas y es más bien depende de lo que le está sucediendo al país?
Yes, I think there's definitely similarities, and the current environment, for example, the one that we find ourselves in right now with a pandemic, is certainly very influential in terms of across all organizations. Everyone's very focused right now on health and safety and the economic impact. But of course, private organizations tend to have different focus. Typically, they're focused on their shareholders. Now, you're seeing a shift there as well, where we are seeing more private corporations start to think more broadly about who is their part of their ecosystem, who should they be serving, and thinking more about stakeholders and not shareholders, thinking about the community. So in that regard, we are seeing a shift where private organizations are starting to understand that it's not just about driving more profits, but they can no longer operate in a vacuum. They have to think about the well-being of the broader community. So we're starting to see more overlap between public sector missions and goals and those in the private sector as it relates to the future.
Dentro de las cosas que nos apareció fuertemente como para hacernos cargo del futuro, y dado que en Chile la preocupación social es tan importante, salió altamente mencionado, por un lado, los liderazgos que tengan un foco ya no tan tradicional, más abierto, y de manera también muy fuerte la diversidad en los equipos. Nos decían incluso esa diversidad que duela. No tan solo que vayamos a hacer como ir a mirar qué hay de distinto, sino que de verdad incorporar gente de todo tipo, no tan solo de género, desde los boards, de los directorios, hasta los equipos de más abajo. ¿Eso es algo propio de acá o eso también está sucediendo en el mundo, esto lo de los liderazgos y lo de la diversidad?
That is actually a very common issue worldwide right now. We are finally realizing that without diversity, there is no creativity. Without diversity, there's no way to really embrace change and the future. And to put it quite simply, we all have a filter for information. And when it comes to the future, we tend to filter information and evaluate it based on what we already know to be true. And usually these filters were shaped and created, these mindsets, maybe 10 or 20 years ago. So imagine in a VUCA environment, you're getting all kinds of new information and you're processing it using a 10 or 20-year-old mental filter. Why does this relate to diversity? Because my filter is formed by my worldviews, by my experiences, by my upbringing. And if I can surround myself with other individuals with different life experiences, different worldviews, then our collective filter is going to be much more powerful. And we're going to be able to make sure that we're not missing the future, that we're not blinded by the change that is around us, which is often what happens to individuals and organizations. We can sit back and say, how did they miss it? How did Kodak miss that change or that disruption? And it's because They had mental filters that wouldn't allow them to see it. So diversity helps us avoid blind spots.
Yvette, mira, te voy a compartir 3 páginas más de los resultados que tuvimos en el estudio que hicimos, mira. Otra de las preguntas que hicimos a los entrevistados fue si ellos habían anticipado la crisis social o la pandemia del coronavirus. Y los resultados fueron bien decidores. En el caso de la crisis social, un 66% de los entrevistados no esperaba una crisis, solo un 34% la esperaba, y el 100% de los entrevistados no esperaba que fuese de la magnitud que terminó siendo y todavía la estamos viviendo. Respecto a la pandemia, solo el 9% esperaba que podía suceder algo de este estilo, y la verdad que ese 9% además fue en un futuro muy corto. Finalmente eran aquellos que que tenían alguna conexión de negocio o relacionamiento con gente en Asia o en Europa. Después nosotros también les preguntamos qué tan preparadas están las organizaciones para anticipar el futuro en Chile. De hecho, ahí les pedíamos que se abrieran no tan solo a su organización, sino que en general. Y el 91% nos dijeron que definitivamente no. Dicen que hay mucha conversación, mucho de lo que estamos haciendo ahora en estos momentos, pero había poca acción. Incluso tal vez los más adelantados hacían algo de futurología, pero se quedaba en un ejercicio nada más que de esto. Chile es un país muy abierto, sobre todo económicamente, y nos decían que estamos súper conectados, pero conectados desde la información, y no permeaba más allá de eso. Sin embargo, y aquí te quiero poner la tercera pregunta que les hacíamos, nosotros les explicábamos lo que era la prospectiva, que algunos lo sabían y otros no, y el 85% de los entrevistados nos dijo la prospectiva estratégica es extremadamente importante o muy importante. De hecho, nos ponían como ejemplo a Amazon y a Apple. Nos decían, ellos dos fueron visionarios, por decir algo, y vieron un plazo mucho más largo, y fueron exitosos por eso, porque se anticiparon. Y por otro lado nos decían que además el corazón de las decisiones del directorio y la alta dirección de las compañías, las organizaciones, consiste en eso justamente, en anticiparse. Entonces acá te quiero preguntar, más que el resultado en sí, ¿no hay una aparente contradicción en esto de que están súper claros que hay que anticiparse, los líderes, pero por otro lado, la verdad es que no hay una anticipación, que quedó súper demostrado en este último tiempo? Entonces, tengo que hacer, pero no lo hago. ¿Cómo ves eso?
It's so interesting, and again, not unique to your country, a very common phenomenon. I think instinctively, we know we should be taking the long-term view. Unfortunately, our systems, our structures, our political systems, our economic systems are built around short-term thinking. So it's not enough to have a desire to have a long-term perspective. We have to make systematic changes in the way that we govern, in the way that we manage our economies and our businesses, and the way that we educate our students all the way up. Until we make some of those fundamental changes, there's no way to create long-term thinking in a system that only rewards short-term behavior. It's fascinating, the question about the pandemic especially. We've known about these illnesses for years. We've known the potential. Perhaps no one could have potentially mapped or believed the extent of the disruption, but we've had issues around health and safety. So these are not new things. What we are seeing is a failure of imagination. And we have to implement processes in our organizations, in our education systems that teach these skills, that develop these mindsets to think in not just long term, but in simultaneous multiples. That's a lot to think about, but the idea here is that there is not one future, but from where we stand today, there's an unlimited number of futures. And if we could train our leaders, political and organizational leaders, and our youth to think in simultaneous multiples and map out multiple scenarios, then we can start to see real change. Until then, it's only going to be a desire that meets against true life where short-term wins are always going to be rewarded. So we have to make systemic change for this to actually take hold. It's great to hear, however, that people desire it. That's wonderful. Now we have to show them the value of it. Let me just finish by saying that it's a mistake to think that the future is about the future. The future is actually about today. Because how we think about the future, consciously or unconsciously, directly impacts the decisions we make each day. And if we can show our leadership and our government the connection between tomorrow and today and how it impacts decision making, then I think it would make a huge difference.
Yvette, y pensando en que esta disciplina es una herramienta, es una forma de hacer, pero antes de eso necesitamos algo más profundo, tal vez de que comience en nosotros mismos, porque si yo no estoy convencido, es como que aprendo algo mecánicamente. ¿Qué tan relevante es eso? ¿Qué tan relevante? Porque eso para mí es mi sentido de la vida, tal vez en una organización le llamamos el propósito. ¿Qué tan importante es eso, más allá de la metodología que después quiero profundizar?
It is so relevant. So many of the individuals that we work with, both within organizations and in our public-facing programs, have a spiritual experience when they go through our programs, because ultimately what we're helping them do is unlock their own ability to direct the future. We all have the ability. In fact, we're all creating the future every day with our decisions that we make. Foresight gives you agency, empowers individuals, unlocks the ability that's already within them to create better futures. And it's something very, very impressive and impactful when you allow someone to feel like they are back in the driver's seat in terms of directing not only their own future, but the future of their community. So it is very much a personal journey that is fortified or strengthened by the tools and the repeatable process.
Ahora te quiero preguntar ya más desde la herramienta, ¿cómo se lleva a cabo esto? ¿Cómo haces el cambio? Porque primero, claro, nos dices tiene que venir de adentro, porque si no, no es genuino y no tiene liderazgo probablemente, el liderazgo necesario, pero ahora, ¿cómo se hace en la práctica? Ustedes que lo han hecho tantas veces.
Yeah, well, there's many ways. Every organization and institution is unique. We have to recognize their culture, their leadership, their current situation. But I can give you some general rules of thumb of how we've had success. First of all, beginning with the individual. Before the pandemic, I used to spend a lot of time on airplanes. So for those of you that travel extensively, you will recognize that in the safety script that they share with you, they talk about the oxygen mask dropping, and they say that if you're traveling with someone, put your mask on first. And the same is true when we practice strategic foresight. When we have leaders come to us and they say, my leadership doesn't believe in this or doesn't support this, We always tell them, apply the tools in your own sphere of influence first. You will have proof of concept and you will begin to influence others. So that's one option. Many organizations implement strategic foresight within strategy, within long-term planning. They use it to improve their 3-year or 5-year planning processes. And in that situation, typically that could look like scenarios. Organizations can also implement strategic foresight within innovation efforts to fuel more long-term thinking around transformative inventions and innovations. And then lastly, I'll share that a very common entry point that is successful is within the human resources function, using strategic foresight as leadership development to strengthen and improve our leadership across the organization. Strategic foresight is an excellent tool for that as well. So those are just some examples of how foresight can begin to be used within an organization.
En varias sesiones que hemos conversado respecto a estos temas y hemos presentado el estudio también, aparece una pregunta muy particular de Chile, porque nos dicen, lo que pasa es que los tomadores de decisión somos muy conservadores, estamos muy acostumbrados a hacer, por decirlo de alguna manera, el caso de negocio, a hacer el plan de negocio y ver cómo da, y muy lineal todo. ¿Alguna vez has visto, me imagino que sí, este tipo de situaciones? ¿Cómo haces la transformación para que se entienda del valor de que esto, cuando tú haces escenarios a 10, 20 o más años, no hay un valor claro, son escenarios? ¿Qué recomendación darías para hacer ese cambio de acuerdo a tu experiencia?
Yes. So it's actually not uncommon to have conservative leadership. In fact, the US can have very conservative, linear thinking, very data-driven decision-making. And there's no real data about the future. So if you're driving all your decisions about the future regarding data, you're only using the past. And that's extremely dangerous in this environment. So there are a number of ways where you can influence decision-making. If we were going to do a scenario planning process, our ideal situation is to include the leadership in as much of the process as possible. Because while the scenarios are an excellent outcome of the work, it is the process itself that is truly valuable in shifting perspectives and changing mindsets. All too often, we focus so much on those scenarios that are what we think is the end of the process. In fact, I often joke that people think of scenarios like a time capsule. I don't know if you have this convention in Chile, but in the US, we have this idea, or we have this concept where we take a time capsule and we put the current year's, pop and influential concepts and games and toys, and then we bury it. And then 20 years later or 30 years later, people come and they dig it up, and I don't know why this is the thing, but this is the thing. And so we cannot think of our scenarios like a time capsule. That is a waste of time. After we've created scenarios, that's when the process really gets interesting. That's when we use those scenarios to develop new strategies or to pressure test our existing strategies. If we don't do the scenario planning, then there's really no purpose in creating scenarios. So I think one of the mistakes organizations make is that they run out of energy or resources and they only create the scenarios. They don't do the planning work that should come from the scenarios. That's the true value. And then they also don't involve leadership in the process, and that's really important too.
Con todo lo que nos estás contando, esto más bien parece establece un cambio cultural. Aparentemente ese es el mayor desafío, más que los pasos 1, 2, 3, 4. Y en ese sentido nos venimos a Chile, Latinoamérica. ¿Qué sabes tú de Latinoamérica, de Chile, desde el punto de vista cultural? Que si tuvieras que pensar en nuestra gente, ¿qué recomendación darías pensando en nosotros?
I think it's important, whether we're talking about an organization's culture or the culture of a community or a nation, when we're thinking about the future, that we do think about what is unique and what is in the DNA of that culture. Let me give you an organizational example. Many organizations that we work with want to be more innovative. And so what they typically do is they conduct benchmarking. And they discover that Google, for example, in your survey, I think Google came out, is very innovative. So they explore and they research, what does Google do for their employees? And the idea here is that if they just implement everything that Google is doing, that all of a sudden they'll become more innovative. From a nation perspective, let's take an example of a nation like Estonia. Estonia is extremely innovative. They have digital identification assigned at birth. Everything is digital. E-signatures carry the same legal weight as a physical signature. And as a result, Estonia saw very little disruption governmentally during the pandemic. They were already digital. They're a digital society. I'm not going to suggest that Chile do what Estonia did, because we have to do for Chile what makes sense culturally for the nation. So one of the first things we have to recognize is what is at the core of the culture as it relates to long-term thinking. We do some work in New Zealand, and the Maori indigenous people, their word for the future is essentially the same word as grandchild. So in that culture, we leverage the idea of legacy and the generations to come and how our decisions will impact them. I imagine that in Chile, something similar could be powerful in terms of understanding our legacy to future generations, our children's children's children. So exploring cultural aspects and what is really valued as a culture can help us identify those core elements that will allow us to be more futuristic, as opposed to just trying to copy what other organizations or other nations are doing. That's not going to work. It has to be true to the people of Chile.
Yvette, tú mencionaste las organizaciones públicas, porque las compañías usualmente, no siempre, pero usualmente tienen equipos más estables en el tiempo. Sin embargo, por ejemplo, en nuestro caso, los gobiernos duran 4 años y usualmente cambian, si no todos, una gran mayoría, con lo cual la mayoría de esas personas tienen una agenda muy corta, tienen que mostrar resultados muy cortos. ¿Cómo han hecho en otros lugares para que eso de verdad trascienda y sea de largo plazo?
That's a difficult one. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of we have a desire to think long-term and we understand the value proposition, but our systems and structures are not set up to value long-term thinking. And the political terms and term limits, we have similar in the US. Right now, I'm extremely thankful for those term limits, given our current situation. But that does promote the tendency of 4-year cycles of thinking. So I don't have an answer, because I think that it would be extremely challenging to have longer term perspectives. But I think continuity within our leadership publicly, accountability within those positions are critical. And in order to do that, the most important thing is an educated electorate. So if you educate citizens to understand and engage in the political sphere, to hold those leaders accountable and to elect leaders that reflect their long-term values, that's really the only way forward, in my opinion. But it is very challenging. I would add, I'm seeing more and more private sector and entrepreneurs become more involved in the public sphere. There is a blurring of the lines between all of these spheres. And you saw it very critically during this pandemic, where we have called for private organizations and entities to develop vaccines, to help with, all of the requirements necessary. So I think more and more you'll see a blurring of the lines between these different spheres, and leadership in all realms being held accountable to more long-term perspectives.
Estaba fácil la pregunta. Lo que pasa es que nosotros miramos con cierta envidia que hay incluso ministerios del futuro en Nueva Zelanda, en algunos países nórdicos, etcétera, pero por lo menos a mí personalmente me da una cierta esperanza, porque a principio de este año ya España nombró también no recuerdo si oficina, qué calidad tenía, pero sí en el gobierno una oficina dedicada justamente a mirar el futuro, que digo, me da una esperanza porque nos parecemos un poquito más a España que a una Nueva Zelanda, por lo menos. Te quería preguntar, hace un rato también hablaste algo de la innovación. ¿Cómo se conecta la prospectiva con la innovación?
Yes, I'll answer the innovation question, but of course, yes, there are quite a few governments now that have positions specifically dedicated to the study of the future across Europe, in the Middle East as well. The UAE has a concerted effort around the future. In fact, their plans are 10 to 20 or 50-year plans. And then the government of Singapore has spent extensive time doing participatory foresight. So I do think that is a valid point and a hope for the future that more governments implement those types of positions and departments. In terms of innovation and foresight, I think in a previous era, we could innovate thinking about more of the short term, thinking about rapidly getting a product to market to potentially disrupt what was there. Unfortunately, in today's environment, your future threats and your future opportunities are going to come from outside your industry, not from within it. And disruptors are abound. So if you launch a product or a process or a service or an experience without thinking about the long term, you're wasting your time. You're going to put a product or a process or a service out there, and it's going to immediately be disrupted by somebody else. By thinking very deliberately about what that product or process or experience is meant to service and what the long-term potential is in terms of new transformations before you go to market, you'll be much better prepared to weather disruptions if they come. And rather than just, make incremental innovation, make the screen a little bit wider or change the color, that's not going to work in this environment. We have to create transformative invention. We have to think about what is in the DNA of those ideas and look at its higher order purpose before releasing that, and have a plan for how we're going to continue to update those innovations for long-term success.
Vamos a dejar un espacio en breve para preguntas, pero no quiero dejar de preguntarte antes. Yo comenté al principio, vamos a hacer el primer taller de Foresight con ustedes en Latinoamérica. Entonces, que nos cuente un poco de qué se trata el taller, cómo es.
Excellent. So we are really excited to partner with Symnetics Chile in November to offer a 3-day program that we call the Applied Foresight Accelerator. This program will be dedicated and focused on participants across Latin America, and it'll allow us to do small group activities if individuals would like in Spanish. The session itself will be facilitated in English, and it will cover the entire toolkit of strategic foresight. This is our flagship program. We've delivered it across the globe. It is a very, very fast-paced 3 days full of hands-on application, small group activity, a really powerful experience for anyone that is looking to immerse themselves in the field and be able to get tools and applications right away. They'll be able to apply what they learned at the training the very next day in their work. So it's very practical, very fun and engaging, and we would love for everyone to join us.
Qué bueno. ¿Recomendado para algún tipo de persona en especial o abierto?
It's really open for everyone. We love to have a diverse cohort, just like we talked about earlier. Diversity is a core element of success with strategic foresight. So whether you are working in policy or government, in the private sector, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're an individual that is at a crossroads, you are thinking about what your next step is, please join us. We will give you frameworks that will help you make sense of everything that's happening around us to make better decisions right now for yourself, for your family, and for your business.
Bien. Ahora vamos a ir con algunas preguntas que nos han hecho. Y la primera dice así: ¿cuánto de arte y cuánto hay de método en hacer prospectiva? Por ejemplo, ponen la inteligencia artificial profunda. ¿Incorpora el foresight en su aprendizaje, en su abordaje?
Yes. We use an equation of sorts. We say foresight is data plus research plus creativity and intuition. So one of the first things we do in a strategic foresight process is to mine the environment, to scan the environment for weak signals, for trends, for discontinuities. We make sense of those signals and create patterns, emerging landscapes of change, and perhaps then scenarios depending on the project. So in that regard, we only have data about the past. When we start to incorporate things like artificial intelligence, we just have to be aware that those tools are programmed by humans who themselves potentially have biases and blind spots. So we see those as tools, like many of the other tools in our process, but ultimately individuals, until we know otherwise, have agency to create the future. And so it is really important that individual leaders are involved in the process of deciphering what is happening and deciding what to do to go forward.
Otra pregunta. A propósito de la diversidad, dice: cualquier ejercicio de foresight debería incorporar la mayor diversidad posible, y aquí hay un ejemplo, porque para una empresa sería bueno incorporar a muchos stakeholders o incluso actores de fuera de su ecosistema, porque tal vez lo que entiendo la pregunta, la diversidad se entiende como solo desde adentro, pero aquí nos preguntan si en estos ejercicios también hay que incorporar actores que no tienen nada que ver con la organización.
I love that. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Organizations become insulated. And we see them fail because they aren't able to see what's happening around them. When you bring external stakeholders into the process, they are able to see things that the organization is not able to. So I highly, highly recommend bringing in external stakeholders into the process. Throughout the process, the success we've had globally when that happens is almost 100%. When we're able to bring in those external stakeholders, we always have a better outcome.
Qué bueno. Otra pregunta. ¿Podemos pensar que la práctica de la prospectiva es una extensión de algo ya conocido o crees que hay que definitivamente abandonar prácticas antiguas?
That's a loaded question. I don't think it's realistic to say that we're going to abandon existing processes, because I know how organizations and I know how human beings work. I think it's far more realistic to say that we're going to augment our existing processes using strategic foresight and little by little make the transition to more transformative long-term systems and structures. Again, there are unique examples of smaller organizations that are able to completely wipe out what they've been doing, but that's not really how change works. Ultimately, foresight is a change management process. The reason why people struggle with change is because the future is uncertain, and we do not like uncertainty. What foresight allows us to do is to not eliminate uncertainty, because that's impossible. We can't eliminate uncertainty. I can't predict the future. Nobody can. What foresight allows us to do is learn how to leverage uncertainty as a competitive advantage, as a power that we can yield to create better decisions in the present. And so through that process, you'll begin to make changes within your organization. But there are great processes that exist today that can be augmented. For example, I already mentioned the 5-year plan, something like design thinking. Not sure how prevalent it is in Chile, but design thinking augmented with strategic foresight is so powerful, and it takes it to a whole nother level. So that's an example that I can share, that we wouldn't want to, in the US we say, throw the baby out with the bathwater. I have no idea if there is I'm sure there is a Spanish saying for that, but we want to make sure that we meet people where they are.
Otra pregunta. ¿Cómo es posible implementar o hacer la bajada de un ejercicio de foresight? ¿Cuánto tiempo uno debiera considerar para hacer esta implementación?
It really depends on your scope. So if your desire is to influence leadership development, that can have a much shorter time frame. You can begin to make change in that area after just one session with the right leaders in the room. If you're looking to inform strategic planning processes and you want to create scenarios, as an example, not every foresight effort involves scenarios, but it's a very powerful tool in our toolkit. A typical scenario process can take between 3 to 6 months, depending on the level of engagement within the organization, etc. But you don't necessarily need 3 or 6 months to start making more, shorter time frame changes in leadership or to inform current decision making. So it doesn't have to be 3 to 6 months, but if you're doing scenarios, it would be that time frame. You can certainly make progress in a much shorter time frame. It's really about the integration points and understanding where in the organization you would like to focus your energy, whether the senior leadership is on board or whether it's a particular department you want to start with. All of those factors can impact, but you can have a significant impact in a short period of time.
¿Hay alguna preferencia por dónde comenzar o en general cualquier lugar de la organización?
I love to begin in areas of the organization where I have willing participants, where I have a sponsor for the work. So if I have a senior leader in HR that is excited about this, that can be where we start. If I have an organization that has a particular need in innovation, or they just conducted a merger, and that's the critical need, I think finding the problem that we're trying to solve and using foresight to solve a problem is critical. We don't just want to apply this just for the sake of applying it, because it will not have long-term impact. We have to find the problem we want to solve. Is it a strategy problem? Is it innovation? Is it leadership? And then finding those willing sponsors is also critical.
Otra pregunta, dice así: la contingencia nos tiene en un lugar muy disruptivo, no solo por la pandemia, sino que por el estallido social en nuestro caso. ¿Cómo se atiende una prospectiva en un momento en que el humo del incendio solo releva el presente y todos los días escuchamos solo hablando desde el hoy?
It's an excellent question. I'm really hopeful that as a globe, we take a look at the current crisis, and before we act and try to act quickly, as you said, to put out the fire, my hope is that we look at the underlying systemic causes, not necessarily of just the virus, but the underlying systemic causes that have made this disruption so impactful. For example, in the US, we have underlying systemic issues around inequality that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. So my hope is that our leaders and as communities, we understand the why behind some of these issues. And when we rebuild, we don't just rebuild what we had before. We take this opportunity to think, to look at things like providing, base income and services, universal basic services across the board for our communities, or thinking about private sector responsibility for traditionally public sector services, things like that. We have a unique opportunity that this crisis has provided. Will we take it? Will we take this opportunity to really look at our systems and our structures and our organizations and say, we want to do things differently going forward? I really hope so.
Vamos a ir con la última pregunta por una cuestión de tiempo. Y dice así: en economía es usual escuchar hablar de ciclos. El largo plazo centra el valor de los activos a la media, y por otro lado, en las humanidades y en las ciencias sociales también se habla de lo cíclico de la historia. ¿Cómo convive esto con la disrupción? Dice: si uno graficara la percepción actual de esta incertidumbre, sería un gráfico de muchos altibajos en frecuencia, que no se sabe cuándo y por qué tendrá más amplitud. ¿Qué opinas de esto?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we often talk in our toolkit is built on the panarchy, which if you study growth curves and panarchies, different parts of our systems have different speeds of growth curves. For example, technology moves very quickly, right? Whereas social change is a bit slower, and the public sector or governmental is the slowest. But all of these curves are really nested, and they impact one another. So technology speeds up social tries to slow down technology, as does governmental. So within its core, Foresight recognizes all of those different cycles and really understands that what we're trying to do with strategic foresight is we're trying to build a stronger immune system for ourselves and for our organizations. Again, we're never going to be able to predict the cycles, but what we can do is we can equip ourselves, our leaders, organizations with the capacity to bounce back through resilience, to adapt because of disruption, and most importantly, to identify those unique opportunities for transformation. So you're no longer being reactionary, but instead you are setting the pace, you are creating the future. So Foresight really acknowledges those cycles and recognizes that we must be ready to be resilient, adaptive, and transformative at any moment in time.
Bien, con esto estamos terminando. Muchas gracias, Yvette, por tu tiempo y por compartir con nosotros tu experiencia, contestar todas estas preguntas. Ha sido muy interesante. Y también gracias a todos por su tiempo. Invitarlo a que nos sigan a través de nuestra página y nuestras redes sociales, LinkedIn, el canal de YouTube e Instagram. Si tienen más preguntas también las pueden hacer. Hay también más información respecto del taller de noviembre. Y nos vemos una próxima vez. Muchas gracias, Yvette.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Simnetics Chile presentó Sesión Futuro.